And on Daybreak, we have been talking about the provincial management of some of its oldest forests. The BC Forest Practices Board released a report in December saying the rules are 20 years out of date. And that has prompted calls for a halt to primary logging in Prince George from conservation groups who want the rules to be reviewed.
So the current biodiversity order, which basically sets out the legal objectives, it doesn't require the mapping of areas that are going to be retained or left aside, so protected from logging. This is a huge problem, and the board report concluded that that actually needs to happen. We need to identify on maps where the most at-risk old growth is and promptly protect it using something called old growth management areas. So defining where old growth is spatially is key. You would think that that would be really obvious in the first place, but licensees have gotten away with actually not doing that for the last 15 years.
That's Conservation North spokesperson Michelle Connolly, who was on Daybreak with us recently. On the line to discuss this issue and more is Katrine Conroy. She's Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Welcome to Daybreak.
Thanks, Carolina. Thanks for having me on the show.
I mentioned that provincial commission that put forward the recommendation to protect large old trees from logging. Now Conservation North, as you heard, is asking for a moratorium to halt old growth logging in the Prince George area. Where do you stand on this recommendation?
Well, we really appreciate the work done by the Forest Practices Board and this report. And the board it really plays a critical role in helping us develop sound and forest and range practices that are actually in the best interests of BC. And our government is really committed to doing things differently to protect vital old growth stands and supporting workers and communities in our province. And we know that I know, and I think a lot of people know, that the previous Liberal government, it did leave behind a patchwork of measures on old growth that didn't work. So that is why our previous minister, Minister Donaldson, he commissioned an independent report on old growth by a pair of really respected foresters in our province, Al Gorley and Gary Merkel. And Gary's a member of the Tahltan Nation from up north. And the work of that report, we've begun to implement. They began it almost immediately. The first action from the report was done in September, where they protected 250,000 hectares of old growth in 9 areas across the province, including Seven Sisters up just north of Smithers up your way. And that's the area protected was nearly 353,000 hectares, because you just can't protect a stand of old growth on their own. You have to protect the ecology around it. So it was, I think that was a first measure, and I know it was a first measure that we're moving forward with, and just it's important to know that those areas were selected for immediate deferral after initial consultation with the impacted First Nations in the region.
What we heard recently from Conservation North is that currently loggers aren't breaking any rules, but the loophole that is being implemented is to log old growth in the Prince George forest area by setting aside other parts of the forest, younger parts of the forest. What sort of changes are going to be made to those rules?
Well, I really appreciate the work done by the number of environmental organizations across the province who are really concerned about this issue, as are we. And that's why we need to look at we did look at the recommendations, and we need to implement them on the recommendations from the old growth report. And what we're doing is a number of steps we're moving forward on. But I think it's important for your listeners to know that the number one recommendation, the number one condition required for change from the report was to engage the full involvement of Indigenous leaders and organizations to review the report and any subsequent policy or strategy development and implementation. And that is what we're doing. It's critically important, as most of your listeners know, that we pass the DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's not just words on paper. It's actually, we have to follow up with action, and we want to, and that's what we're going to do. It's consultation with Indigenous organizations, as well as that important government-to-government discussion that has to happen. So we are doing that and looking at what else can we do to ensure that we do protect old growth forests.
Recognizing that importance, would you then consider a pause of old growth logging, a moratorium on it until those rules can be reviewed and that engagement take place?
Well, what we need to do is do things properly, not quickly. We need to make sure that we are having those consultations, and we also need to ensure that our plan, it protects vital old growth while still supporting workers and their families and the communities in our province that are supported by our forest industry. Forest industry is still vital in this province, and we need to make sure that we support it, but also support the many communities, especially up in the north. There's a significant number of communities that are supported by forestry in this province, and we have to make sure that we're all working together to do what's best for the province.
So respectfully, would you consider a pause of old growth logging in Prince George until the rules are reviewed?
So we're looking at the recommendations that came forward in the Forest Practices Board and talking about it to make sure it reflects the history of the effects on the land base, but looking at the new knowledge and information that we've got, and then we're working with Indigenous leaders and organizations on a government-to-government basis through the Environmental Stewardship Initiative to assess the biodiversity and old growth in the Prince George areas. And actually those assessment results, they're just being finalized, and they're going to form the foundation for land use planning in the area and making sure that there's revisions to the biodiversity land use order.
At this point, some of these rules that are being used are 20 years old, and some are wondering why it's taken so long to make changes, particularly after the devastation of the pine beetle infestation and recent forest fires. Mm-hmm. I know that these conversations are important, but how soon will there be changes made?
You're right. Like the policy around Prince George Timber Supply Area was established in 2004, and it was based on the best science that was available at the time. But it needs to be done properly. And since that time, we've had things like, as you say, spruce and pine beetle outbreaks, and then the devastating wildfires. I mean, it's really impacted the old growth in that area, and we now need to do, things need to be done differently. And because of that, I'm actively trying to get legislation passed with our Forest and Range Practices Act, as well as our Forestry Act. There's parts of the Act that are, I think they're over 100 years old. I mean, so we need to make those changes to make sure that we're coming into the 21st century. We have to change regulations so that everybody has a say on how forest practices are carried out in this province, including Indigenous nations, including workers, including communities, and including environmental organizations.
Minister, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I really appreciate it.
Katrine Conroy is the Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Your thoughts on logging practices in the Prince George area? What would you say if you were sitting at that consultation table? Email us, daybreaknorth@cbc.ca.